Tātou tahi nei, tēnā tātou a karoro tahi nei, tēnā tātou a whakaro tahi nei. Kia ora tahi, tahi ho tahi nei. Welcome everyone. I'm quickly just going to give you housekeeping. The toilets you'll find are just out this door here and straight down to the glass door there. For everyone that's online, you know where your own toilets are, hopefully, or in your offices. If there's a fire alarm, just follow one of the members of staff here and we'll take you out, and it's the stairs just by where the toilets are. If there's a duress alarm, it actually tells you that it's a duress alarm and we just stay in the room. And earthquake, drop, cover and hold. But I'll hand over to John now.
Thank you. Welcome everybody who's here live, and to all the people online, also welcome. My name is John McDermott. I'm the Executive Director of Motu Economic Research, and we are very happy that we're co-hosting this talk with Treasury. And so thank you particularly to Treasury for providing the venue, this wonderful venue. Just as we proceed, we will do the questions after the panel session. I will try to take questions both from the live audience and from those online. And if you're making comments, please, we want to be a robust debate, but if you can be respectful, that would be fantastic. Our speaker today, it is my great pleasure to welcome Julia Lane. Julia is Professor at NYU Wagner Graduate School of Public Service and NYU Postal Fellow for Innovation Analytics. Did I get that closely right?
Yeah.
Closely. He co-founded Coleridge Initiative, whose goal is to use data to transform the way governments access and use data for the social good through training programs, research projects, and a secure data facility. So all things close to Motu's heart. So we're very much aligned in purpose. So really fantastic to have you here. And we also have a panel, 3 people on the panel to discuss the comments today. Dr. Megan Stevens is Principal Advisor at Treasury Analytics and Insight Team. Our current research is focused on microsimulation modeling, household incomes, inequality and poverty, with an academic background in mathematics. She's also worked in industries such as weather forecasting and energy. So that'd be fantastic. We also have, we have Isabel Sin. Izzy is a senior fellow at Motu Research and a principal investigator with TPM. Izzy's research fields include labour economics and economic history. She has published research spanning the effects of labour market policies, the effects of parenthood on labour market outcomes, the cause of gender pay inequality, and the drivers of international diffusion of knowledge. Izzy has worked extensively with Stats New Zealand's Integrated Data Infrastructure, or the IDI as everybody knows it, the Longitudinal Business Database, and Unit Record New Zealand Census data. All things closely related to Julia's activities, I do. We also have Gary Donnett. Gary is Statistics New Zealand's Deputy Chief Methodologist. I think that's such a wonderful title. He has over 30 years experience as an official statistician. He spent most of his time as a methodologist. He has worked in many parts of the Stats Office, including subject matter areas as the national accounts, business performance, and census. Gary is very active in the international and New Zealand statistical communities. Gary is passionate about the development of technical staff and innovation in the statistical system and processes, such as always looking for opportunities for staff development to try something new in a supportive and inclusive environment. So a great panel, great speakers. Julie, I invite you to the podium. We're looking forward to it very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, well, thank you so much, John, and thanks to Emma and everyone and Anna who worked so hard to get this organised. I'm very grateful, and thanks to you guys for being on the panel. I have to say it's wonderful to be back in Wellington. I'm actually from the great metropolis of Palmerston North originally, from the hub of the Manawatu, so I kind of think of this as a little bit home territory, if that's all right to say that. So please feel free to interrupt me and ask questions as we're going through this. Even though John said pick questions to the end, I'm going to buck my if you've got any clarifying questions, feel free to pop the question up, but substantive questions we should deal with. So before I get started, anyone know who that is? Yeah.
Rosalind Franklin.
Yeah, so why am I putting Rosalind Franklin up there? What's she famous for?
He's being excluded from the celebrations. But the fact that she was valued for the actual award.
Well, she, that's exactly right. So Rosalind Franklin was actually one of the people who discovered DNA, in fact, is credited with the discovery of DNA. The paper that was published was by two men, Crick and Watson, and she wasn't recognized. And it was, and then she died, they got the Nobel for it. And then Watson wrote this book about why I am so wonderful, and future style, and didn't even mention her contribution. And some of her friends read the book and they said, what do you mean? So there was this big ruckus about how she had not received any attribution for her work. And so, you know, this is a little bit the motivation for the conversation here, because you know, there's a long history of the contribution of different types of people. I'm going to focus here on women, but different types of people to the generation of ideas in the production of knowledge. And the reason so we're here at New Zealand Treasury, which cares about economic growth, Stats NZ is co-sponsoring it, Motu is co-sponsoring it. One of the things that we care about is the contribution of ideas to economic growth and many other things like health and so on. And my colleague at NYU, Paul Romer, got the Nobel Prize in 2018 for some work that he did on the endogenous technological change, which is basically talking about how the production function, the standard Clem's model, is you can rethink that when you think about the value of human capital and the production of ideas to the organization of science. You can think about ideas as, I think Heidi Williams has put it, relaxing the bounds of scarcity. Because what you're doing is you're figuring out how to combine inputs in new and innovative ways, right? And so the insight that Paul Romer had was that ideas are non-rival. So unlike investing in capital and labor, where if I consume capital and I consume labor, I consume energy and materials, that's gone. If I eat an ice cream, I get it. You don't have had far too many of those here. So anyway, that's another story. But with ideas, once I have an idea and I share it, the more I share it, the more value is generated. So the idea of the organization of science in the creation, transmission, and adoption of ideas, it's not just investing in science to have the ideas, but it's also to set up an organizational structure within which those can be shared. Does that make sense? So I'm going to start with this, I'm going to end with this, but I just wanted to give you kind of the Cliff Notes approach. Says misbehaving. All right. I think what you did changed my controls. So I can't move it. So, fantastic. Thank you. So I'm also going to put this in the context of some of the work that I've been doing in the US, where we've been thinking about building data for evidence. So this is a broader issue with the federal government and with state and local governments. And I sat on this committee. It turned in its report to OMB in October. But we're basically trying to think about, as the government invests a lot of money in different parts of the economy, in health, education, workforce, and so on, how can we build an evidence infrastructure or a data infrastructure that provides evidence to make informed policy? With all due respect to our colleagues at Stats, certainly at the essentially what Congress and the executive branch, the presidency, said, the data that we have is inadequate for decision making. We need to think about how to use data and how to create new sources of data to inform it. So I'm going to kind of riff off that and talk about the ways in which we generated a data infrastructure to inform investments in science and research, which are the basic core of thinking about innovation and economic growth. Does that make sense? And actually, one of what happened was in 2008, 2009, I was asked to go back to NSF, the National Science Foundation, to build a science of science policy. Now, the challenge that we have and continue to have in the US, and I think to some extent in every country that I've visited, is the basic idea is for researchers, we're much better than health and transportation and labor. We're just really good spend money. And if you don't spend enough money, horrors, you're against science, right? And so, the saying on the Hill is scientists are welfare queens in white lab coats, right? So just don't evaluate us because of that. So in 2008, 2009, we were asked to build a data infrastructure and an evidence basis to inform investments in science and research, because just shoveling money into the pit isn't kind of long-term sustainable. This got a lot of interest after the 2008-2009 big contraction, which is here in New Zealand as well, the Great Recession. But what the Obama administration did was they started to say, let's spend money in science because it's going to create jobs, but you had to show what the jobs were. So this early work in 2008, 2009 was very closely related to this 10 years, 13 years later conversation, and is the basis for the data infrastructure that we built, which is going to be the focus of the conversation today. Turns out this CHIPS Act, the more time passes, the more things are the same. They're spending money again in science for semiconductor research, but also in R&D, and they're saying, okay, what's the evidence that that's going to create jobs? So that's one thread that I'm going to be pulling on today. The other thread is the push in the US, certainly under the Biden administration, to think about diversity, the importance of diversity in contributing to science. The NSF has referred to this as missing millions. we have millions of women, millions of African Americans, millions of first-gen immigrants that are not in the science and engineering workforce. So they want to, one of the policy interventions is going to be, let's try and figure out how to get them in. Diversity creates new ideas. I served for my sins on a second White House task force, which is the National AI Research Resource Task Force. And our report is due to President in Congress due this month, but it's going to get delivered next month. But basically, if we're in a world in which AI matters, and we want to see all the ideas and innovation, we want it to be diverse. And of course, there's an executive that is pushing this. Those are big words. We get lots of words in Washington, probably here in Wellington as well. How on earth are you actually going to implement that? How are you going to figure out who's missing, how many of them are missing, and why they're missing? Because until you can figure that out, you can't figure out how to get policies in place to effect any change. Okay? So let me take an example, and I really appreciate Stats who said, you know, put this in a bigger context, and that's why you got the bigger context, so thanks, Grant. So let's take this particular example, which is actually the motivating discussion that we published in the Nature piece that I think was in the invitation that we've put in. And I'm just going to say, this is actually my first, I've got pieces in the science, and I've got kind of op-eds and stuff in Nature, but this is my first research piece in Nature, and I've been amazed at how much attention this has got. This is clearly, I don't know, it was published in June. There are I took a look this morning, there are 70,000 downloads. That's more than I think I've had in my entire life, but 70,000 downloads. And it is out of 1,000 articles in Nature of a similar age, we're number 10. So I was like, whoa, this is really hitting a nerve. But here's the policy issue. Again, motivated by Rosalind Franklin, although we could substitute any group in here. So here's the motivating fact. We started to work with the data that I'm going to describe in just a minute, and we saw when you subset productivity, scientific productivity by gender, women are a lot less productive than men across the board. So, you know, we had a very large data set, and when they look at publications, the level of publications, the citations, the patents, and so on, they're much less productive. So we went and looked at the literature, and it's not just our data. There's a PNAS piece, Proceedings National Academy of Sciences piece that got a lot of traction as well. And women are just not as productive. Okay, so I posited yesterday when I was talking to you that it might be that women are just not as good. And he thought that was probably not a good thing. So, you know, how are we going to figure out what's going on there? Because if there is a policy issue, we would like to unpack it. Now, when I came to NSF in 2009, and I looked at the state of the data infrastructure in science, wanted to be able to figure out what's going on. Essentially, the model, as Jack Malberger said, who was the chief science advisor at the time, the model that we had is send money, magic happens, and you get ideas. Not a particularly good model. I co-chaired the White House interagency group on a federal research roadmap, and we said, the data infrastructure is inadequate for decision making. In other words, here we have an economy that is founded on innovation and ideas. We have an economy in which a lot of the productivity growth, take a look, as I was saying yesterday, you take a look at the top firms in the United States. They're firms that, are based on their Apple, Amazon, and Microsoft, that are based on ideas, not on producing things. They're not producing cars or refrigerators anymore. They're based on the transmission of ideas. And we don't know how to intervene and make a difference. So it's not just the United States, the Europeans. So this is back in 2009. The Europeans try and figure out, well, what's the results of our investment in research? So what they did is they paid for a study to be done, and what a shock. Everything that they do is either a breakthrough or a major scientific advance. Isn't that wonderful? ERC is just doing fantastic work in everything. You could have people make ad hoc measures like the Times Higher Education rankings or the Shanghai rankings, which just count, how many Nobel laureates you have and so on. And what that essentially does, and this is a piece in the BBC, which says, well, if you're just going to count, we're just going to merge universities and we're going to go up in the rankings, which is what they've done in France. You could do something really stupid like the British, really phenomenally stupid. You pay a lot of money for people who are chemists and engineers and physicists to describe what their impact of their research is. It's going to cost you, this is an old slide, but it's £250 million, not counting the value of the science that comes in, and you're going to get a lot of stories. Or you could do something close to being stupid, which is what the Americans did under the American Recovery Act, where they had to write down how many jobs were created. So every principal investigator was asked to say, how many jobs did you create? And they wrote down a number and they reported it to recovery.gov, which was going to be the way in which the American public could see what the results of their research investments were. And that's the result. So here's what we tried to do. And this is the basis for the data that we're going to do. And this is the basis that I think, I'm biased, obviously, because I've been thinking about this for a while, but I think New Zealand could potentially emulate and plug into potentially to the IDI. So here's the basic idea. Think about the dollar spending. What's your theory of change? It's not, oh, I send money and a miracle occurs and I get ideas. What happens is that money goes to fund scientific work. Science is work, it's like anything else. And so it goes to fund infrastructure like computers and buildings, and it goes to fund people. And so what you really want to do is you want to be able to knit those pieces together, because it's this combination that creates the ideas. So how are you going to build that infrastructure? Well, you can't do surveys. Ain't going to work. You want to have relatively timely and actionable information at a relatively fine-grained level, because so much of the impact of investments in science are local. And we just can look at that from the impact, for example, of Silicon Valley and UT Austin. It's because ideas, Oppenheimer said, the best way to transmit knowledge is to wrap it up in a human being. So you transmit ideas, people are generally geographically bound. So, you want to be able to track that. So the first thing is let's capture the information about what grants are being made, what funding is being made. So the insight here is that when a grant is being made, the funding agency or the government agency provides a project code. Says, you know, I'm going to use a US example, NSF makes a grant to NYU. It provides a code 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 million bucks. Sends it to NYU. NYU creates a code A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And then every charge that is made is charged to that code. Every purchase, every person shows up in HR and finance. I can then track on a bi-weekly or monthly basis, depending on how people are paid and how often the vendors are paid. I can track that information. I've got very detailed claims data at this point on the production function of science. At the unit of analysis at which innovation is done, which is teams. So science is team science. And then you can see what the output is. So that's the infrastructure that we built. We pulled in HR and finance data from the payroll and financial systems of the universities. Turns out there are only 3 or 4. And you can just write a script. It takes about 20 hours to build the script that pulls in the information, and then it's just push button from there on. And then you can tie that to information on publications, patents, and then using the IDI in principle, the flows of individual into the real set. That makes sense? So it's not relying on administrative records in the traditional way of thinking about it, but it's a way of creating a new data that could in principle actually transfer to other parts of the economy. We happen to be focusing in on the academic sector, but pulling HR and finance data is possible in principle from every business in the country. Real-time information on the inputs to economic output. This just shows you how it all works. It's obviously confidential. This is set up at a University of Michigan Institute for Research on Innovation and Science. And there has been value proposition to the universities. So I'm not going to go into that in any detail. I'm going to cut to the chase here. It's also being made available, as is the data from the Nature piece, for researchers to come and have access. But it's a pretty big data set at this point, covering about 40% of university funded R&D. Like it to be more, but that's where we are at this point. Okay, so now I've given you the setup. Now let me walk through how we're going to use that data infrastructure to understand the organization of science and what's going on with the underrepresentation of women in science. So there could be a number of reasons why women are publishing and patenting less. Right? It could be, and there's a whole bunch of literature that looks at output and says, well, maybe it's because their family responsibilities, damn kids get sick. You know, they choose different paths. So that's a policy. That's a set of policy recommendations that if this were true, you could kind of come up with. And, you know, so that was kind of the initial story that we were writing. And then I kind of woke up in the middle of the night and I thought, really what's going on, what could be going on, is that women might be not credited for the work that they're doing. And what happened was I'd been teaching my inference class in statistics, and I taught this. So anyone seen that before? Yeah, so up the back. So what's that about?
It's an attempt to determine where to put protection on bombers based on the ones that get back where the bullet holes are.
Yeah.
The problem is the ones that you don't see the ones that don't get back.
You don't see the ones that don't. So it was during World War II, sending bombers over, and you know, they were losing a lot of men and a lot of planes, very expensive. They decided to use data to figure out where to reinforce. So this is a policy decision, right? Use data. So what the RAF was doing was saying, let's plate where the data is showing the most bullet holes are. But it's conditioning on planes return. So they're conditioning on the outcome measure, and where they really should be protecting is here. So this is where I drive my husband crazy, but up in the middle of the night, and I'm like, this is missing the process. They're not understanding the data generating process, and they're going to miss all the Rosalind Franklins. Now, how are you going to find that, right? If you're only looking at the output, you're only looking at publications and patents, you're never going to see all the people who've done all the work. So here's what we had to do. We took our data, because it's all the people who charge, so graduate students, postdocs, undergraduate clinical clinicians, research associates, and so on. And we're going to pull all of that information together. It's about 650,000 individuals. We're going to group them into teams. We're going to link the team output to, we're going to link the output of the teams, and we're going to look at the patents and the publications. And by the time you've turned it into an analytical data set, it's about 10,000 teams. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to effectively take a look at a PI, Bob, or in the United States, Barb. When I had to go meet someone whose name was Barb, I came in and I said, can I meet with Barb, B-A-R-B? They thought I was talking about Barb. No. But anyway, we have on this team a bunch of people with these different characteristics. And when it comes to looking at the publications, so we know who's on each team. And then when you take a look at the publications, you can see who gets named as an author. Does that make sense? And I can do that with every specific team. And I'm going to have 3 different measures. We're going to say, are you ever cited as an author? On a particular paper or patent, were you cited? And then on a high impact thing like the Crick and Watson, were you cited? So that's what we're going to look at. So here's the money graph right here. Just trying to figure out how to date this information. So down here, the kinds of arguments that people make, well, fewer women are faculty. Endogenous, but still, fewer women are faculty. Or women are in different fields in the publication list. We've got that information. We know where they're there. We know their job title. We know the field they're in because we've got the text description of their projects. We know how long they've worked on these projects because we've got their time information. So here you can see the proportion of women who could potentially be authors by their career progression. So yes, there are fewer women faculty, about 35% of women are faculty are women. About 65% of research staff are women. So the higher up on the career path you are, the fewer women there are. Now, here is what are their share of authorships. This is the share of the potential authorship pool. Here is the share of realized authorships. If authorship was independent of sex, now no causality here, these are just descriptive statistics, everyone would be on the 45-degree line. You see systematically below. Here, same picture, but by scientific area. Women are a much higher proportion in psychology and health, much lower proportion in physical sciences and engineering. But the story should be the same. If there was potential authorships were the same as actual authorships, they'd be on the 45-degree line, and they're not. Okay, might be less productive. So, natural thing for economists to do is then to start adding controls. So these are the raw statistics. The orange is female, the purple is male. And so we add controls. No controls, the number of months, the job title, the field, fixed effects for research teams. The results are the same, whether or not you're looking at articles or patents. When you take a look at article impact, so it turns out the probability of getting named declines systematically the higher the impact of the article. So we thought that was pretty compelling. If you take a look at the supplementary information, you can see we cut this. This is about as robust a result as you could possibly imagine. I've never been as, hit the data a million times and found the results. But the editors, which is Nature, the editors said, we need to triangulate this a little bit. You can see here, this is in the supplemental material, it's incredibly robust, no matter how you cut it. The reviewers said, would like you to do a survey. So what we did, and the details that are in the paper, so I'm not going to go through it in too much, but we asked about their role on the named paper. Obviously, you only see people who authored, and then we said, well, you left off anything. A really interesting thing here is we have over 2,600 responses. There are a ton of people who wrote, notes and personal anecdotes and wanted to be interviewed, both men and women. And across the board, both men and women felt that they had been systematically left off papers, and some of it is, personal responsibilities, maternity or paternity leave is over here. Left the lab was here, but over here, the two big things, contribution did not justify authorships. This is men, this is women. Others underestimated my contribution. This is men, it's still a big number for men. And then this is women. So the point is here, not, oh dear, this is terrible and, I'm going to cry. It is, this is a loss to science. If we rely on a signal of productivity being publications or patents, it's a very noisy signal. That's one point. And then the second point is, it can have a chilling effect on people's decisions to continue in science and to contribute to the scientific process. Flipping the story just to the dual of were you recognized or not, is to say for every given contribution, and we used project credit, which has like, I believe, 14 different categories of the scientific process: conceptualization, data curation, formal analysis, funding acquisition, and so on. Every piece in which you contribute to the production function of science, men reported were in order to get over the authorship barrier, men had to do less. Does that make sense? So that's the difference of these bars. And there's only one area in which men did more. That's here. Software. So a little bit stereotypical here, but okay. So the persistence. Then you ask why. And I'm not going to go through these slides in the interest of time, but I'm just going to say, and this also helped when we called the respondents. They said, well, maybe I didn't, the women would say, maybe we didn't ask enough. But then other women would say, well, when we asked, it backfired. A number of them said, I'm talking about this as a woman or as a man. The men would say, they also said, I didn't push. But they said, for people of different cultures, of the two people who have different personalities. You know, it's a rough edge sport, as all of you know, and those rough edges can have discouraging impact. Too scared to make too much of a fuss. A number of them also talked about the power dynamics. So this was not a universal thing. So I don't want the message here to go and saying there's a bunch of jerks who are being unfair. However, it is clear that there are some jerks. So power dynamics is code for someone being a jerk. There's another point is a policy issue, which is lack of clear criteria. You start off a project, you're all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, you don't know what it's going to take. And at the end of the day, if you don't have rules, you know, it's just kind of this random generator. That has implications for the organisation of science as well, right? Because then people don't know what the rules are, and then you can't perform. So coming to the end, what are the consequences for research and innovation? And a reminder why we care about this. I'm a cold-eyed economist, right? I care about the impact on economic productivity and growth. Well, you're going to push people out who are not going to continue. The noisy productivity signals I talked about, and it could potentially discourage different groups systematically. So what can we do about it? Well, you know, it used to be, certainly when I started, you know, you'd basically be doing your research by yourself, maybe have a graduate student, but now it's big science. You've got these hard-driving, innovative teams. You're typically pulling in big money. You know, you get recruited for big packages, generating $10 to $15 million a year in grants. It's a reasonable sized organization, but we're not trained to handle these big teams. I mean, anyone I've ever worked with will tell you I'm a lousy manager. I have no idea how to manage. We should train people a little bit better, since that is now part of the scientific process. People who are getting trained in graduate school need to learn how to ask. Project credit can help. You know, we can then also, again, we're scientists, we can look at the impact of different interventions to see how different interventions can improve things. There are broader implications. I started out with this big vision. I narrowed it down. I just want to point out that the type of data infrastructure that we're describing does represent an even lower burden than administrative data and can be built for purpose, pulling in information from HR and finance records. New unit of analysis, our IDI, certainly in the US as well, but the unit of analysis, we call it a firm, but that's a tax unit of analysis, not an economic unit of analysis. We're thinking about developing different units of analysis to describe the new types of organizations that we have. The work I did with Carol Corrado a few years ago argued that we should look at teams. There was just a way of capturing it. We can now do that. This approach also enables you to measure industries. I was talking yesterday about that as well. I'm on the AI task force. How do we measure AI? It's not a scientific field. It's not an industry. How do we measure synthetic biology? How do we measure quantum computing? Well, this would be a way of capturing how many people in New Zealand are working on a particular area because you see the grants. And then when you see them flow through into the IDI, you can see, oh, that firm might be working on synthetic biology. That firm might be working on AI, cutting edge AI. So you could describe industries by the ideas that have been generated at that firm, rather than what is produced, or in addition to what is produced and how things are produced, which is the SIC in the next comment. I'm going to argue it's a new way of thinking about R&D policy interventions. And I said that was where we're starting. interested in understanding the organization science, using data to do it, and kind of the motivation for why that's so important, knowledge and wealth of nations. So, there you go. Oh, no, that's correct.
Yes, so I can invite that.
Unless there are clarifying questions.
Any quick clarifying? That's what we all have, so.
Yep.
Just a second, so, yeah, he just said.
Of the survey respondents.
I can't remember off the top of my head. It's in the nature piece. So if you click on it, I'm getting nothing about this.
I'm on 70,000.
One of the 50,000. And you could tweet about it. It actually has, it's starting to get traction. People are really interested in this way of understanding what's under the hood, really. I don't remember, it was a smaller proportion. I mean, it was roughly in proportion to the authorship, because obviously women. The survey itself is selecting on the observed.
Sorry, there was a hand.
I have a,
And a woman at that.
I have a question about the world of science, which you're using for one of your sources. What's its scope? Does it cover open access journals or more the narrower range of
That's good.
traditional journals? Because women may well be publishing more open access.
So that was one of the issues. So the question up the back was, what's the scope? Are women, because it was Clarivate, the Web of Science. Does that also cover open access? And what about books and different conference proceedings and so on? So we actually cut like all of those as our output measures, because those were some of the questions. You should be a nature referee. So we cut by all of those in the results for the robust. Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll, are we good to go?
Oh, yep, sorry.
I think we will take the panel. So you can be first up for the questions when we come after the panel. But if we, the panel, then we can take some more.
I'll be very quick. I've only got 2 pictures, I promise. So first of all, I'd just really like to thank you for your presentation, Julia, which links 2 really subjects that are really close to my heart, women in science and linked data, because it wasn't in our introduction, but actually our whole team works in the IDI, and basically without the IDI, we wouldn't have a job. So I don't
take a check at the end of the.
So I know that you're really heavily involved with that. So thanks very much. It's been really useful for lots of policy questions. And Treasury has, and the whole of government has made great use of it. So the core idea of this work, I'm just going to pick up on, is this estimating who's missing from the data, basically. And that comes up quite often in some of our IDI research that we're looking at, for example, who's not accessing certain transfers or support systems. And it came up actually during the response to COVID. So without the IDI, we wouldn't have had as rich data on who wasn't vaccinated. And that did inform some of the decisions about who would go and who would be targeted by policies. And that was very much about the missing, who's missing.
Actually, can I interrupt?
Yeah.
So I should have credited Dave Murray for the idea, because he's the one who got me to come to New Zealand and was my partner in crime in getting the IDI started.
Well, there's a lot of people were involved, and we're very grateful to all of you. I can see some of this audience.
So Nick Carroll, I mean, there's so many people who contributed.
Yeah. So yeah, I just very quickly, I'm going to pick up on a few things about who else is missing. So on the subject matter of uncredited women, I've really gone down a bit of a rabbit hole in my research before this talk. It's very interesting, and I'd encourage everyone to have a look. So this picture here is some of the programmers working on the, I think it's ENAC computer. And that's the first programmable computer around 1945. And the first people to actually program the computer were women. Yet they're referred to when they pop up in these photos as refrigerator ladies, and they weren't given credit until the 1980s. So it's just a good example, and especially as a coder myself and a coding team, who often people forget about the coders and the data people in the background. And that's probably something that academia is a bit better at than some
government agency sometimes. But anyway, so there's been many women who've ended up in this situation, but I noticed when I looked through it that many of the uncredited or identified uncredited women were people who are working at the more practical side. So people like coders and people like Rosalind Franklin, who actually took that first picture of the DNA structure. And I thought, people usually say that this is maybe because that's where they're more likely to be involved. But actually, maybe it's just because those are the sort of contributions that we can more easily identify. So people who are more involved with the sort of at the sort of less easy to prove ideas stage of the scientific breakthroughs, maybe we haven't even found those people yet. So I'll skip on actually through this, but just really taking on board this whole idea of taking credit for other people's work. This is actually some Treasury work that was done by the organizational development team, and luckily enough, it was just published. So it's a different measure, but it's the same sort of theme about, but here we're talking about the gender pay gap in Treasury. And when I first saw this, I was just so shocked at how high it was in 2002. It's quite stark, but the good thing is it has been progressing in the right direction over time. And as I said, this is just one statistic from the report, which wasn't my work, so I do encourage you to go and read it on the Treasury website. So one thing that I thought here is maybe, so it's often not just about women getting paid less than men, it's about women or men being more likely to be in these higher paid positions. So digging into this report a bit more, you see that in the principal advisor role of Treasury, which is kind of a thought leadership role, and pretty much as high as you can get in the thought leadership role. I don't know, someone might correct me. Only a quarter of those people are women, and that's still a very low representation. But talking to our cohort of principal advisors, there is a good point to make that that actually it's probably a bit of a stock and flow situation, that you need a lot of experience to become a principal advisor, and maybe these policies that have tried to address the gender gap haven't quite, there's still a bit of a lag that needs to be worked through. But also I think picking up on this who's missing idea, which is perhaps something that could be done with the IDI data, is who's actually left Treasury because they didn't get promoted. Are they more likely to be women? What did they leave for? And similarly, I haven't got that statistic here, but the proportion of Maori and Pacific people in Treasury is pretty low compared to the population. And so there's that question of why are they missing from who's applying for the jobs. So just very quickly to end on a more positive note, though, I want to recognise the improvements. So we've come a really long way, both in the data sources and the comprehensive data system, but also in just recognising the contribution of women. Thank you.
Izzy, do you have slides?
No. So my relevant background to this talk is that I've done quite a lot of work on gender inequality. So most of what I want to do is sort of relate what Julia has shown us here to what I've done, seen, heard about in the wider literature. The first thing that I'd like to address is a question that Julia asked me. So she said, in the context of your work in gender inequality, are you surprised at these results? And the results I'm talking about, obviously, the core result in terms of how much credit women get for the scientific research that they're involved in. And I have to say, I'm not at all surprised. So I'm not thrilled with that result, but it's not a surprising result to me. So my sort of general overview of the field is that whenever we look for gender inequality in some way, women disadvantaged, nearly all of the time it's there. So for instance, women are paid less for work of equal value. They get a lower share of the rents generated by their employment. In academia, if they're co-authors on a paper, it's considered that they did less of the work. Maybe they were just a junior co-author, they were just the RA on the paper, anything like that. And there are millions and millions of examples I could go on. One thing that I find in talking to people about this sort of thing is that a lot of people say, well, I don't believe that based on my experience. And I think one thing to bear in mind is that when we see a result like this, it doesn't mean that every research team is treating their female members badly. It just means that enough of them are that it makes a difference as a whole. So I think it's really dangerous when people start saying, well, that's not my experience. I was in a team, I was a woman, I was treated great, I was a co-author on all these things. So I think we need to be careful of thinking about our own biases that we bring from life. It's not that this has to be happening everywhere. It's just happening in enough places that it does make a difference. So I think a second important question to think about is, well, was I convinced by the story that they're telling? So I think taking the whole paper as a whole, I think it is fairly convincing that there is a gap here, that women are doing more scientific research and they're not being credited on. I do have a few questions, and maybe Julie would like to respond when we get back to her on these. So it was not entirely clear to me how we can distinguish between two things. So one is that are women in a research team getting less credit for the papers that they contribute to, which is the story being told here. Alternatively, is it that women within a research team are less likely to contribute to any piece of research? So I think the additional analysis, the survey and the qualitative results here feed into this, but maybe Julie can get back to this point in terms of the administrative data. So if I can quote for the paper a minute, it says scientific documents were linked to a team if the article or patent acknowledged one of the team's grants and or any member of the team was listed as an author on that article or patent. And then the researchers, so Julie and her team, are then studying the proportion of articles or patents that are attributed to the team that each researcher was listed as an author on as one of these three measures. So I guess a few things that I wonder is, so are men more likely to be involved in each project that the research team does, or are men more likely to have like side projects that aren't with their sort of core research team that are maybe something that's going on in another team? And I wonder if either of those could be contributing to the gap that's being found. So there are, if you look at the numbers, there are very low overall rates of attribution to individual scientists engaged in these research groups. So it does seem like there might be some give and take that could allow this sort of mechanism to be going on. The other thing that I noticed is there is an absolutely massive gender gap in women being named on patents, and I'm really curious about that. I'd love to understand more about what's going on there. So I guess I have to bring a spirit of healthy skepticism here, and I wonder, are women less interested in doing the practical work that might lead to patents? Are they being discouraged from this? Are they being taught that that's not the sort of thing that they should be doing, taught by society or taught by their mentors? Is the potential financial gain either less attractive to them, or do the people who are making these decisions think that it's less important to them because maybe they're less likely to be the main breadwinner in their family? So I think there are a lot of interesting things that could be feeding into this. I'd love to understand more about what's going on. So one of the things, I think Julie did raise this point, that it relates to a larger literature on gender inequality I'd like to touch on. So we heard in the survey that women who don't advocate for themselves tend to get excluded from co-authorship. And so, of course, whenever people hear stories like this, they think, okay, well, let's just tell women to stand up for themselves. And I do think that this is likely to be part of the solution, but of course, it's not that simple. And some of the survey responses made this point really nicely. So women who tried to advocate for themselves did receive backlash. So getting shamed in front of the group and this sort of thing, that actually happened. But obviously it's not just about humiliation at the time, it's about how does that feed into your relationship with these people in the future. You may be working with them for years, you may hope to be attributed as a co-author on later projects. All of these things are at risk when a woman stands up and said, I deserve to be a co-author on this paper. So when we are looking at the situation, we so much is decided by the person in charge. And what they're deciding in terms of who is a co-author is partly on the basis of personal relationships. Can women really afford to get a reputation for being difficult? And I think we need to ask ourselves that question when we're saying that women should ask for what they think they deserve. So I see a lot of interesting parallels here to the literature on bargaining and gender equality. So in that literature, there is considerable evidence that women are either less willing to try to negotiate or less successful at negotiating for things like to get hired, to get a higher salary for promotion and all these sorts of things. And I think there are a number of reasons that can explain why, and some of these are likely to relate to the situation we're looking at here. One is social norms. So women are taught by society from when they're very young that they should be caring, they should be cooperative, they should not be too pushy. And then this is reinforced because women tend to be punished when they don't fit into this compliant mold. And this is likely to make women, it's taught women not to advocate for themselves or made them less comfortable doing so, giving them less practice at doing so. And of course, if we're looking at a woman in a male-dominated scientific field, if you're in the minority, it's going to be even more difficult to speak up. But even when women do stand up for themselves, so for instance, they ask for a well-deserved pay rise or promotion, experimental evidence shows that there is often backlash that comes because of stereotype threat. So women are not doing this, just chilling, getting along with everyone, cooperative thing, and they get punished for that. So women who do this tend to be perceived as difficult or pushy. But if men do exactly the same behaviour, they're seen as confident, they're seen as leaders. And so women are acting in this environment where they're well aware that these sort of can be pushed on them just when they're asking for what they deserve. So I think these things are likely to apply in a similar situation when we're thinking about asking for co-authorship. But I think the bargaining literature also offers some things that could be potentially part of the solution. So for instance, it has been shown that women don't suffer from this backlash and stereotype threat when a third party advocates on their behalf. And I wonder, could there be potentially any way to operationalise this sort of thing within research teams? So it's not the woman herself saying, I should be a co-author, but some impartial third party saying this person contributed a lot, they should be a co-author. And final comment that I'd like to make. So one thing that jumped out at me reading the paper, so if I can quote, an overarching theme, this is from the survey, was that the rules governing scientific contributions were often not codified, not understood by all members of the research team, or simply ignored. So if I can relate this back to the hiring literature, so research in that area shows that if criteria are less clearly and objectively defined, then personal biases play a bigger role. So the personal biases of the hiring committee, and if it's more about cultural fit, and what does cultural fit mean? It means like people like us, which is usually, white men. So in terms of co-authorship, what we've got is a situation where maybe there are guidelines, maybe there aren't, but even if there are, there doesn't seem to be a general agreement that they're going to be followed. It seems like that could be an area that's ripe for improvement to attend to the situation. The gender inequality literature also shows that in some situations, though I say certainly not all, even just making people aware of their potential biases can reduce those biases. So I think when we combine these points, it seems like there could be the potential for more widespread codification of what is required for you to be a co-author, and then putting those guidelines out there, some expectation that they'll be followed. And while reminding the people who make these decisions, actually, bias can cause you to unfairly not put certain people on the co-authorship list. So obviously we can't eliminate judgments and these sort of things, but it seems like there is potential to move some of these things in the edges, and that could be really in a really important way. Thank you.
Gary, can I invite you all to the last panelist, and then we'll ask Julia to respond to the three panelists and then the general question.
Okay, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Gary Tokuinga. I'm Gary, I'm the Deputy Chief Methodologist, also the white male in the but no, so look, I'm from stats, so I'm gonna look at it from a stats perspective, so hopefully. So I'm just going to touch on some of the data that we have available, talk a little bit about the IDI, but I'm sure I'm talk to converted, and then also just think about what we might need if we try and get a picture of the New Zealand sciences. So MB have produced two surveys, one around research, science, innovation, workforce survey of organisations and individuals, and I've just snipped a couple diagrams out of that for papers. The link at the bottom will take you to the paper, or if you go to the MB website. These were released just this month, so they're actually quite up to date. Some very interesting results in there. I do want to draw your attention to this column down here of actually, for example, Maori, how underrepresented they are here, just against the population share. It's negative on every count. And also, obviously, with female, it's negative in many counts, but there's also, like you said, some of the positives sort of, I suppose you'd sort of say down, which is sort of similar to the results that Julia was showing through her bubble charts of the centre axes. But also, the top left graph of male female split across into the levels of tertiary research, business and overall. when I look at individuals, so this is a survey of individuals. So again, some very stark contributions. Data over here, looking at there is funding appears, at number 1, number 3, and sort of so it's still funding, needing more funding, will come. But also, and when you talk about at the bottom about what how the workforce can be strengthened, funding at the top, career development, and then diversity and inclusion. So some very similar results that I think we're seeing through the surveys that have been done here, and what Julie was talking a bit about. Well, I'm sure preaching to be converted, but we look at the LBD, longitudinal business database with inside the IDI infrastructure. We have a wealth of information sitting there, and under each of these topics, there are lots of other supporting data that is actually relevant to what we talked about. So the government assistance program data is sitting inside some of the innovation data that we've got. Also, I should say that on top of this, there is a huge amount of research and let's say code that's actually supported across the top of this. So I'm sort of thinking about the works of Richard Faber and code about productivity measurement and how you can actually run the code across this and work out different levels of productivity engagement spillover. And so within the IDI, we follow the Naitone Tikanga Pari, which is about, it's actually taking a Maori world view to actually how we assess and undertake research within the IDI and the LBD. But the idea is not it's to actually try and be inclusive. And so these are why we do some of the analysis that we do. The idea is that if we take an inclusive approach, then through our research, we should be able to try and pick up and differentiate across different sectors, different relations, different genders, different ethnicities. So if I just sort of step very quickly to so what might we need for a picture is that we do have, the ANSREC, which is a research classification. We have a number of surveys. We have the LBD. We also have the ORCID ID, which, as I understand it, is put to every piece of research or every researcher. So we actually have a link potentially. We have the Research Science and Innovation Domain Plan and the National Statement of Science and Investment. Now, I think there are some challenges, and we've the panelists and Julie have sort of touched a little bit on this. As I mentioned before, there's a sort of desire for more funding and also career development. But also, I think we've talked a bit about some of the biases that are in the data, and I would suggest that in some of the administrative data that we have, those inherent biases or unconscious biases are right through the whole data. So I think that will mean that any analysis you do will actually, you need to be really cautious about the sort of the results and points you make from it. Julia touched on the fact that for things like data science and AI and that, they actually aren't industries. And how do you define them? How do you identify people or businesses that are involved in such activities? It's evolving and it's really quick. And I can tell you, as someone who's recruiting data scientists, the capability is from top of the range to quite low, because everyone wants to have data scientists on the bottom of the email tag at the moment. In fact, I've seen people who've used Excel call themselves data scientists, which as a methodologist I do struggle with. But there's also some challenges, and these challenges have been around for quite a while. And when I was working in the national accounts, we did a lot around productivity, trying to measure the flows, the spillover effects, and the value chains, and thinking about actually how do we identify and quantify the value or the flow of data and information that we've been creating. So I suppose the question I had is you know, what don't we have and how do we get to grow that? So what data do we need and how do we curate that data either through our administrative sources or through surveys? You know, preferably through our admin data, but that's a challenge for us all. So that was all I was going to say. Thank you.
Julie, would you like to respond to any of the comments or questions?
Sure, let me
Okay.
relatively quickly a little bit. So thank you. It is amazing, as you pointed out, when you start digging in, because when we did the initial nature piece and we talked about Rosalind Franklin, they came back and said, can you come up with just a few other examples? So I hadn't thought about it, right? And then you go in and you uncover all kinds of stories. So I thought it was very helpful. Yeah, Izzy, your comments were great as expected, but I was also really struck by the patent stuff as well. And it was the USPTO that originally funded this work. And is it a delay? I think there's lots of questions that could be answered there. The learning how to advocate for yourself, I think that came through over and over again in the comments that people had. And you know, it's just hard for everyone, regardless of gender, right? So that came through that both men and women felt that it was very difficult to be pushy and ask for questions, ask for anything. But it was just systematically more difficult for women to do it. And as you can imagine, I've run into being accused of being too pushy from time to time. So, but I don't know if that's me. You never know whether it's just you being too pushy or whether it's a gender difference. Although, as having worked with a lot of male economists, there is kind of a systemic difference. The point of men maybe working more, you know, that we did control the amount of time that was charged. So we do have direct measures of how much it was, because you can't measure the quality of the input. I don't even know how you'd get about that, but we did try, but there's no causality story. I love the notion of third-party advocate. I know in hiring in New Zealand, we do that for certain groups. So, and having an impartial third party, I think we have an IRB in the US, we have an institutional review board. You could imagine having a review board for publications, just something making it less personal on the back and forth, but having something institutional and some awareness of biases. All of those were fantastic areas. And your comments, of course, they were right on the money. What I was kind of thinking, the IDI is a rich resource that New Zealand is, you know, in the US, we looked to the IDI. It came up over and over again in the work on both the Commission on Evidence-Based Policy Making, the Advisory Committee for Data Evidence. So it really is an international model. It also came up, I'm on sabbatical, so I was in Munich in Germany, and same thing, IDI came up there as well, so it really is a gold standard. I am going to say that I would love to see New Zealand take the lead again and think about, you know, the SIC codes were developed in the 1930s, 40s by what was produced. So that's why we have so many agricultural and manufacturing codes, right? Because it's easier to look at that. In the 90s, there were so many meetings in Washington about redefining things, not by what was produced, by how things were produced, because you think about services, right? That was 30 years ago. And now all the growth is in the measurement of ideas and clusters of individuals working on ideas. And so thinking about how to define industries by clusters of people working on similar topics and categorizing them by the grants that they've received or the scientific outputs that are produced or the patents, that seems to be a logical way, because the ANZ codes are very old fashioned way and manually generated and don't have the flexibility for quickly evolving things. And then being able to, you have an opportunity here to describe the scientific sector and thinking, and I'm not sure on this, but the research organizations, and I forget the CSIRO equivalents, they're government organizations. You should be able to track their activities as much and get some idea of the organization of science and the structure of ideas in a new way, rather than the tax ID codes. And you could imagine Treasury, stats, milestone fund, private organizations like Motu make a run at that.
Let's try and control the questions because otherwise the live audience will completely dominate. We have a range. He spoke to you, okay? Thank you. We've got some mics, but can I please just have one? Or can you, is there any online?
Yes, so we've got a few questions online. Shall we start?
Yeah, just could you organise the questions? Just Julian, thank you for that presentation. I go to lots of seminars and, they're all interesting and some kind of getting marginal contribution. About once every 5 years, I actually listen to a seminar, I get blown away and think, this is going to change the outlook of how I think about things. I'm sorry, and today, I don't want to embarrass you, but today. And also, what New Zealand is going through right at the moment with its review of the research system and with the white paper, people really in New Zealand need to take notice of what you've written, what you've said. So, thank you for all the hard work. Corey, can I read out a question?
Yeah, kia ora. There's an early question from Angela Hanna that relates to what you've just been talking about, the collection of data to evaluate research. And she pointed out there's a new initiative from MB, the New Zealand Research Information System. I can't speak to that. I just wonder if anyone in the room knows anything about that. Initiative.
Are those answers?
Probably that's my question.
Oh, yeah. So then you actually, we've got chairs to the panel. Want to come up? Or is it too terrifying?
Quite high.
Question directed.
This was an address.
Can I also just ask that anyone in the room who's commenting or asking a question, speaking to here so that people online can hear?
Okay, good. If I just take that mic.
Okay.
So you've got.
We had a response up the back about one question.
Did you want to? Who wants to answer it? If I can lean across.
Thank you very much, Julia, for a very provocative talk and really good to get this on the agenda and people talking about it. To follow up from Angela Hanna, who's actually the person at MB who's leading the work on the New Zealand Research Information System. So if she were here, she would have a lot more to say than I do. But it is an MB-led effort to compile grant funding information across coming from different government sources and the recipients of that information. So I think it's probably the closest step that we've taken towards building what you want. Unfortunately, at this stage, I don't think. Well, one thing is it's been going all the 5 years I've been at MB, and it was going before that. It was still working. They were working on that before that.
Veronica Jacobson was and Grant Scully were talking about that back in the day.
And it's still not live, so it's taking a while to build. The other thing is I don't think at this point there's any plans to join it with the IDI, which would really make it very powerful.
So that's what you need to do.
So,
If you want to follow up, yes, agree with me. Like currently the conference of the middle-aged white man.
Complex.
So yes, I mean, I think the domain plan that underlies a lot of the NZ risk that was come up, I think it was 2016, had an awful lot of suggestions for the data that was available and how it could fit, and it would be wonderful if stats and Treasury picked that up and help them get a lot of that stuff included in the NZ risk.
And I'm meeting with
which is actually a bit limited.
I'm meeting with the Minister of Stats this week. So I could raise that if I got an enthusiastic response here.
Yes.
Sounds like.
Thank you.
If they send money.
Yes, thank you very much.
Some follow-up
It was,
questions?
yeah.
Yeah, let me just do it and then I'll compose. Thank you.
Just to add a little to what Simon was saying about NZRES, it is due to launch in February or March next year, and it's kind of in the late stages of development. So I agree it has been in development for a long time, but it is ending that point. And also to follow up on the idea of linking it to the IDI, it's a system designed in that it can be scaled. The currently funded parts of it are just the capture of grant information and people that is flowing to, but more, it's designed in a way that if more money is put into the system, then it can start to capture the kind of research impacts and outcomes parts of the sort of knowledge generation
If
side.
you send me an email with the details,
Absolutely.
julia.lane@nyu.edu, then I can slide that into my long half-hour discussion with the minister.
We take another online question.
Lost my window. It was from Linda Moore, and it was whether or not you consider following this up with the study of ethnicity and scientific attribution.
That's a great question. So, answers there. So one is, and like Izzy, I was blown away by the results, and it opened up this whole new set of research questions about ethnicity, about, as Izzy said, about the retention of different groups in science, which is kind of the motivating thing. I'm going to say what I'd much rather, so that's one answer. Yes, I would love to do something like that. But the broader answer is the way I've built my career is essentially created these infrastructures and then opened them up for lots of other people to come in and answer the questions, because I'm just not clever enough to do it all. So, you know, the data are available at IRIS in the US. And we have documented it all, and we encourage people. We've already, I think, got 4 research teams who are starting to attack different sets of questions. Because the patent issue, for example, and then who is flowing to different firms, and what are the clusters of those relationships that you could look at. So I guess I'm saying yes, but I'm objecting to the pronoun. Right?
Kia ora. Troy Baston. I'm a Malta affiliate and also co-president of the New Zealand Association of Scientists, which looks after essentially the science workforce issues as its role. So thank you so much for being here and talking everybody through this. It is really the transformative stuff we need. I'm going to try to hit briefly on 3 workforce issues and 3 societal problems we really need to think about, and then ask the question. First problem, PhD students, like much of the world, were having the issue that they were declining in terms of what they were being supported on below minimum wage, only 3 years. Then we get to the next stage, early career in New Zealand, and we basically have no support for people to build their knowledge and move it into our workforce system. And then we get to later career, where Te Puna Matatini research has found that basically, if the system keeps going the way it's going, it will unfix the progress we've made so far in diversity. If you think about that in the context of hyper-contestable research systems, which sort of New Zealand evolved as a typical model in the 1990s, they break little pieces up, don't connect the research. And we think about the cabinet paper, which may be worth a look, that led to the Te Ana Parangi green paper and white paper process that John has alluded to. That really at the heart of that is our inability to address our big issues, climate change hazards, where we need to connect up the research and knowledge. The workforce survey, other things are great. In a way, New Zealand Association of Scientists also had surveys in 2000 and 2008 with Jack Summer we were trying to recreate. My question is, can we actually do this, by working our way forward from knowledge, or do we need to really try some things and just benchmark and experiment radically at this stage to fix the problems that we have?
Can you share my screen? Yeah, so a couple of things. Yeah, PhD students are not well funded, and that's across the board. I think a lot of them think. I'm going to say that there's not enough evidence to go on this, but certainly if you just take a look at the earnings and employment of PhD students and the length of time that they're spending in postdocs, it looks as though, at least in the United States, there's an overproduction of PhDs. There are just too many of them. And so that argues against more funding of PhDs. Right? So the public policy intervention is not to pay them more, but maybe import some of those cheap foreign PhDs into the United States, right? So yeah, if they're not getting the earnings that they should be getting, then there's a market signal working. So certainly in the US, there many of the PhDs are going out and doing non-PhD-like activities, which may be a good thing. They're going to, in New York at least, into being quants and hedge funds.
Can I just?
Looking at those career paths would be a useful.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the option alternative is why don't, one of the radical things we could do is actually fund a number of career paths to address the mission learning problems that we actually need to address. The next question I really expect to. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I wasn't actually, because I was very interested in say that one of my hats at the moment is running on the National Science Calendars, and we've been experimenting on its process level with a lot of the things. So delighted to be here today, and I will increase your downloads very shortly. My questions are very simple actually, and I suspect the answer is not going to be as hopeful as we might want. But what I'm interested in is whether you cut the teams according to whether there was a Bob or a Bart.
So we've got a convention about Bobs and Barbs. And so there's been a whole literature about gender dynamics in teams and so on. So, but this is exactly what one hopes for when one gives a presentation, is people are thinking about 10,000 other things that could be done with the data infrastructure. I'm going to just, thank you so much. I'm just going to show you one thing. So how do you find, so related to your comment, which is how do you find out what work other people have done and make the connections? And so one of the things that we've been doing in my abundant spare time, I've got like 3 major threads of research. And one of them has been to read 84 million, this is Scopus data, 84 million publications, find the data sets that people are working with, as well as the research topics and the people. And so here's, and this comes out of the advisory committee work, but you can see here, for example, if I click on NSF, so this is National Centre for Science, you can see kind of what research has been done over here. And then I can find, let's say I'm interested in what work has been done, for example, in women in science or female scientists. And this then enables me to pull in the publications, Paula Stefanski, Donna Ginter, and the citations associated with them, and the data sets that are being used to inform that decision making. So you can connect with this kind of information. Underneath this is a graph, which has data sets, publications, authors, topics, journals, institutions. And so the goal here is, again, to connect the people who are doing work on similar topics, because we don't have a way of doing that right now. So that is indeed part of the process, and those, we're not quite ready to be releasing that yet, but
yeah, I have another one from the chat. This is from Anatar, and this relates to the gap in attribution research. Have you or anyone done any work on whether there's been a change over time in that work?
so the data don't go back far enough. So that's a fantastic. So when I built LEHD in the US, I was one of the people, just to make sure for that reason. So when I was one of the people who built LEHD, you know, we only had a few years, and over time it grew. And so now we can look at trends over time. Same thing with IBI, when that got started, you only had a few years. Now you've got 20 years worth of data. So the time to start is now. The good news is that if you pull out of the HR and the finance systems, we've been able to go get back quite a few years, at least as long as the HR and the finance information is the same system. They don't change those very often, and there's only like 3 or 4 of them. So it should be possible to pull that information directly from the system. So you, then you're able to do it. Just a caution here, because we looked at teams from 2013 to 2016, and then looked at their subsequent publications out, I think, to 2019. So there's left and right truncation at all points. So there's never perfect data in these.
Okay, back to you. Pass the mic back.
You captured that. So how do we ensure that the data is accurate? And also, who is the owner of data? Who is responsible for the accuracy of data that you capture and present?
What a great question. So obviously we spent in the advisory committee, the data and evidence building, as well as in every project I've ever worked on, we spend a lot of time thinking about the quality of the data. Quality has multiple dimensions, and if you take a look at the principles and practices of statistical agencies, you know, it's the quality of both the accuracy relative to an underlying latent construct, timeliness, there's like 7 dimensions. Yeah, there are multiple dimensions of quality. So, and some of them conflict, like timeliness and how closely it's tied to the underlying latent construct of interest can be very much in conflict with each other, right? So, the short answer is yes, we spent a lot of time worrying about what is being measured. One of the things I've come to terms with at this point of my career is there is no perfect answer, and we're kidding ourselves if we think we've got the perfect answer as measures of unemployment, GDP, or anything at all. Even what a scientific field is, Aristotle struggled with that, 2,000 years ago, and no two people will agree on what a scientific field is. So everything human is error bound. So I think the answer is that we did the best we could. We reported what we did in the science piece. The more people that come in and kick the tires, the more robust and accepted the measures will be. So that's the best answer I can give. Does that make sense? So part of the reason that when I build these data infrastructures, I want to give them away is because it's a community of knowledge that is going to, at the end of the day, ensure the reliability and the trustworthiness of whatever measures it follows. What a thoughtful question, Mike. Thank you.
Thanks for a great presentation, Julia. I was wondering if your data set allows you to identify kind of good apples, teams where women are credited at an appropriate rate, and then if we can look at those teams and ask what are they doing differently and lessons learned.
Exactly, bingo. So in the work that I did with LEHD, one of the very first paper I think that I wrote with Simon Burns, Bristol, was called Job Flows, Worker Flows and Churning. And what it was in the Journal of Labour Economics. So what we did for the first time, I had this, let me just go a little bit into this, if you don't mind. I had this universe data for the state of Maryland on all jobs, all workers in all firms and the earnings associated. And this was the first time really that, other than Bruce Meyer, had worked with these administrative records. Every other work had used survey data. And Simon had written this piece which said, oh, a firm has a desired level of unemployment U star, and it published it in the Economic Journal. And the hiring process is all about trying to get to U star. And so you can describe the hiring process. I had these data which showed that 25% of jobs, that is an employer-employee match, lasted less than a quarter. So, and I called him up, he was in Bristol, I was in Washington, and I said, this approach that you've got doesn't make any sense, because my data are showing all of this, and we called it churn. So it was right when John Halterwanger and Steve Davis published this thing on job creation and job destruction. And what we were seeing was not only that firms were shrinking and expanding, but even contracting firms were still hiring workers, and even expanding firms were shedding workers. So, you know, what was going on there? So we talked about churn rates, and what you'll do if you take a look at that paper, you'll see if you sort firms into quartiles by their level of churn, that is the level of worker allocation over and above that necessary for job creation and destruction. So that's the churn. If you sort them into quintiles in one quarter and then run out the churn rates, I think it was 20 quarters out. So you'll see that the top high churn firms are persistently in the top quintile 20 quarters later. The lowest churn firms are persistently in the lowest quartile 20 quarters later. So it's a deliberate outcome that is presumably the either the behavior of the business person, of the head, or kind of they're just bad managers, right? Then Halterwanger and I did, and Jim Spitzer and Simon as well, we looked at the survival and productivity growth of those firms. The firms that were in the highest churn rate were much more likely to decline and exit, which suggests that, you know, firms that had lousy managers were much less likely to survive. Now, taking that into this issue of the organizational science, one of the things I'm really interested in doing is to say, if we think about the PI as being the firm owner, because really you're selling your ideas. That's what you're doing. That's what I'm doing here, selling my ideas. So, and then you get money for them. That's funding streams. So if I treat my staff badly and they exit, what does that do to my ability to survive and keep selling? Does that make sense? So that's something that you could do. Think about science as being a business. The firm, the organization, right? You go onto a lab and it'll be called marketing lab, right? It is like a business. And then they'll describe all the people who are doing the work on it, but it'll be the Evans lab or the Smith lab or the Jones lab. And so that's, but when you go back to caring about the organization science, there's the caring about the individuals who are lost, but there's also the caring about the scientific process, the firms that die, which might have had bad HR strategy.
We'll take the last question from the online audience.
This is a question from Helen Celia, and it's talking about the end result, I guess. Earlier, the UK's research excellence framework was criticised for being resource intensive. However, the REF also includes impact beyond academia. Do you have other less resource intensive ways of evidencing how research delivers solutions to sector and society?
That's what I just talked about. I mean, the rest is, I am on record in the Times Higher Education as calling it ridiculous, right? It makes no sense. But why would you expect someone who is not an expert in evaluation or in understanding the process of science and who has a vested interest in saying they're doing a good job, why would you expect them to be able to produce this information? It's a complete waste of time. And the information that's produced is useless. So it is worse than useless. Not only do I'd pay money not to have to do it. Anyway, I could go on. But.
So what is that, less resource intensive method of getting, that final society impacts? And
yeah, so you take the data that we have, you tie it to the IDI, that gives you the information that you need. It shows you the flows of people. It shows you the flows of people and ideas into the real sector, and then you can trace that. You can also trace the impact, at least on published science, by tracing the flows of the payments and the idea. So those are the two directions. Costs $25,000 a year for a university to belong to IRIS, but the long-term cost of something like IRIS is about $3 million a year for the entire United States. And the cost of universities, it's a push button. And that, of course, you want to fund that IDI, but it's a very, very low cost activity relative to the millions of pounds at the rate cost.
Starting to run out of time for the formal presentation, but for those in the live audience, there are some refreshments. So if you didn't feel pushy enough to take questions, feel free to stay behind and you can ask questions of Julia or the panel more one-on-one while you enjoy some refreshments. But before we say goodbye to the online audience, I do have a few thank yous. Well, I do think these public policy seminars are incredibly valuable and debate issues and try and improve that debate. So I do have to thank our sponsors, Malta's charitable organisation. We couldn't do this without financial help, which we get from EPL, the Productivity Commission, but also this time Stats New Zealand and Treasury. So thank you for those organisations who support this activity. Also, particularly thanks to our panelists. You've made your time available to think about these issues and make the debate more lively. But Julia, thank you so much.
I'm so happy to be back.
Yeah, it is wonderful to have you back.
And yesterday I had Stats NZ presentation. Be back in Palmerston North and to see the Ruahinis, to see the Rimatakas, it feels wonderful.
You get to enjoy that, and we get to enjoy your wonderful ideas. So thank you very much. Thank you. Overall,